Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dale Hansen. I'm the Associate Dean in the McPhail School of Energy here at SAIT. Very grateful to SPE for inviting us to join alongside on this, and really excited about today's session. The purpose of the SPE ESG series is really to further the conversation and further energy literacy in amongst everything that's going on with the energy transition and all that's happening in the industry. Today's event, we have some great speakers here for you, and we have representatives from Cenovus, RepRisk, the Society for Preservation of Oilfield Good Guys, and Avatar Innovations to share their organization's journey with respect to diversity and inclusion. I wanted to take a brief minute. I mean, this is definitely a journey, and SAIT is very much on this EDI journey as well. And I wanted to share a couple of brief words from our EDI strategic plan that we developed back in 2020 for the years 2020 through 2025. So SAIT's mission is to prepare students for successful careers and lives. And out of our EDI strategic plan is this: EDI is a mindset, not a program. It is a way of thinking, doing, feeling, and planning that can be continually improved. It is a journey, not a destination, a process, not an endpoint. At its best, EDI provides the conditions for a healthy campus where the SAIT community feels welcome, supported, and included, and valued and empowered to succeed. So this is just a snippet from our EDI strategic plan, but you know what I'm quite proud of as part of our EDI committee is that we're working on furthering the conversation, and I think that that this event today is very critical for that. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our moderator, Jennifer Dunn.
Thanks very much, Dale. Welcome to today's presentation. And I am looking forward to introducing you all to our four speakers. I would like to give you some brief housekeeping points. Essentially, your microphones and cameras are going to be muted for the duration of this session. And the best way to contact the speakers when you want to ask questions is to put it in the Q&A. What we'll be doing today is 4 10-minute presentations from each of our speakers, followed by a Q&A, and I will be sharing the questions that you drop into the chat during that time. The session is going to be recorded, and you can find it later on the SPE Calgary YouTube channel. Maybe I should introduce myself as well. Hi, I'm Jennifer Dunn, and I was in the industry for about 20 years, and I've been a full-time instructor at SAIT for the last 5. I'd like to introduce you to our 4 speakers today: Kerri Rudnicki from Cenovus Energy, Joseph Schuhow from RepRisk, Brendan Sulz from SPOGG, and I hope Kevin is here from Avatar Innovations. Our first presenter today is Kerri Rudnicki, and Kerri is the Manager of Engagement and Inclusion at Cenovus Energy. While I'm thinking that you know who Cenovus are, Cenovus is an integrated energy company with oil and natural gas production operations in Canada and the Asia Pacific region. And they also have upgrading, refining, and marketing operations throughout Canada and the US. Kerri has over 20 years experience as a human resources leader. In that capacity, she designs and implements diversity and inclusion governance, advocacy, and support models. And she's also accountable for the design, execution, and continuous improvement of enterprise-wide inclusion and diversity programs and initiatives. Please welcome Kerri Rudnicki.
Thanks, Jen. Oh, looks like my presentation went to has a mind of its own. Sorry, 1 second here. All right, so as Jen said, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm Kerri Rudnicki. I'm the Engagement and Inclusion Manager at Cenovus. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about our inclusion and diversity journey. You'll hear me refer to inclusion and diversity as I&D, just for simplicity. In 2021, Cenovus and Husky came together as a combined company. Each of the companies were doing some really great work in the I&D space, but they were in very different places. We've taken the opportunity to review and revisit all of the work that existed in both of those legacy companies, and we're working to take the best from both, but also to chart some new territory. I'm proud to say that Cenovus has made a very public commitment to inclusion and diversity in our most recent ESG goals. We released those in December of 2021. I'll speak largely to the journey that we're taking to advance our representation of women in leadership, but this is a small, although really significant part of the overall journey that we're going to take the next few years. In addition to that commitment, we've also committed to launching a self-identification survey this year. This is a first for the combined company. Legacy Husky had one, but Cenovus did not. And we also endeavor to have at least 40% representation from designated groups on our board and at least 30% female representation. As I mentioned, our first area of focus will be female representation in leadership. You might be asking why we would start with women. Starting with women allows us to put the right things in place to expand our targets in the future. It allows us to evaluate our HR processes and remove any systemic barriers in processes like succession, performance, management, and development. It also allows us to get our feet under us in building things like targeted recruitment, career development, and training, to name a few. It will also allow us to identify and leverage strategic partnerships with external organizations. There's a lot of research that shows that there's a clear benefit to increasing the number of women in leadership. Companies with higher female representation in senior leadership outperform those that don't by delivering a 34% greater return to shareholders. Gender diverse executive teams are 21% more likely to experience above average profitability. Companies with a higher level of gender diversity and with HR policies and practices to support diversity are linked to lower levels of employee turnover. Women are more likely to express interest in an organization and perceive it as fair when women are highly represented in top management positions. Shareholders pay attention to women in senior leadership. It signals sustainability, and they also assume that you're managing gender diversity across the entire organization. Gender diverse boards outperform non-diverse boards in ESG activities. Women board directors are more likely than men to identify social issues like human rights, climate change, and income equality as critical to corporate strategy. Inclusive business cultures and policies are more likely to report 59.1% increases in creativity, innovation, and openness. Homogeneous groups may be susceptible to groupthink, while diverse teams leverage a greater variety of perspective and are likely to consider information more thoroughly and accurately. Teams with different viewpoints or thinking styles solve problems faster. Mixed gender teams can better manage group conflict and maximize creativity among team members. You might be thinking, yes, but wouldn't increasing all kinds of diversity be good for business? You'd be absolutely right. Our ESG target is based on gender largely because today it's what we can count accurately. We want to make sure that our efforts in I&D are data-driven and resources can be applied where they're needed the most. We'll launch our self-identification survey this fall. The timing is dependent on moving everyone into a single HR information system, which will happen later this year. Once the data is gathered and analyzed, we'll identify another diversity target. All areas of diversity are important, but we had to start somewhere. I should note that self-identification questions and how we actually use the data is quite different in the US. We're obligated under equal employment opportunity legislation to report on certain designated groups, and expanding beyond that or having anything beyond aspirational goals can incur legal risk. Many organizations start with gender because it's the one area of diversity that can be easily counted. It also has been shown to be a great place to test education processes and program interventions. It's important to recognize that focusing on women in leadership doesn't mean that we're not committed to opportunities for development and advancement for men. It simply means that we're committed to identifying and removing the unique barriers that women face in advancing their careers. We'll deliver our commitment for increasing female representation and leadership by focusing on 3 key areas. The first is leadership. We'll advance our commitment to I&D and enhance our leader capability and accountability. We have and will continue to engage our C-suite as sponsors of our various employee resource groups. We also see inclusion and diversity as a leadership imperative and not an HR program. We'll launch our inclusive leadership training this year, starting with senior leaders, and then continue on with all levels of leadership. The second area of focus is talent management. It's important to us to mitigate bias and remove barriers so that we can retain and advance women. We'll look at our talent processes to identify key levers in our career development, succession, and training programs. One key focus will be on psychological safety education. We know that employees who feel safe to speak up and be themselves are employees that feel like they belong. The last area is talent acquisition. We'll look at our attraction, selection, and hiring processes for opportunities to make our organization even more appealing to female candidates and to remove any systemic barriers in those processes. A key focus for us is women in non-traditional occupations, particularly in the field. This is an area that women have historically been underrepresented in our industry. All of this work will be done in a way that is both true to our values and engages our people. In fact, our purpose and values were developed last year by over 50 volunteers who were deliberately chosen with a diversity lens and represented every facet of our organization. Inclusion and diversity is part of the culture that we are building as a combined organization. It's embedded in the language that we use in our values and will be woven into everything we do, our people processes, how we talk about our organization, and how we act as we do our daily work. We will partner with our employee resource groups, which represent persons with disabilities, persons of diverse cultural backgrounds, women, Indigenous peoples, and the LGBTQ+ community. We'll also leverage the many inclusion and diversity advocates who have volunteered to engage in advancing our inclusion and belonging across our organization. We will use them to provide advice, test ideas, and pilot the programs that we develop. Thank you so much for allowing me to share our journey to date and the one ahead of us. We're committed to reaching our ESG targets, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Kerri. I really was very interested to hear that, and I'm sure we'll have some questions for you after the presentation for sure. Our next presenter today is Joseph Schuhow, Senior ESG Advisor at RepRisk USA. RepRisk is a pioneer in ESG data science, leveraging the combination of AI and machine learning with human intelligence to systematically analyze public information and identify material ESG risks. Joseph is joining us today from New York, and Joe helps asset managers, private equity, and credit firms implement ESG and reputational risk concepts throughout the investment process. He has over 15 years of experience and demonstrated success, having helped launch his previous employer's fixed income analytics business. Please welcome Joseph Schuhow.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be here today. Appreciate the invite. So we're here from RepRisk. We did put together an analysis of the oil and gas sector that we'll be walking through here. But first, a quick background on RepRisk. So RepRisk specializes in daily updated ESG risk research and analytics. We systematically identify companies and projects linked to ESG risks and violations of international standards. We use public information only, what we call an outside-in approach. So we're not looking at company policies or CSR reports, disclosures, and that sort of thing. We think this is presents our clients with a more on-the-ground, real-time performance metric. So every day, our research starts by screening more than 100,000 different sources and stakeholders across 23 different languages. These aren't just Googleable sources. We specialize in going down to the regional and local level, which is where those 23 languages play really a key role in capturing risk as early as possible. So our clients include asset managers, corporations, government entities, and other ESG stakeholders such as SASB, United Nations, Carbon Disclosure Project, and more. So social aspects of ESG became increasingly important in recent years, driven by the Me Too movement, the COVID-19 pandemic, and racial and social justice movements. In fact, these three developments really moved ESG into the mainstream. Numerous studies point to a clear correlation between increased organizational performance and diversity, and D&I risk events inside an organization have severe reputational and brand damaging implications. Just yesterday, former National Football League coach filed a lawsuit accusing the NFL of racial discrimination, and that is certainly the front page story today in the US. So when we think about diversity and inclusion, we tend to think about matters such as board diversity or wage disparity, which are both very important. And regulatory bodies are implementing or discussing new rules, such as the recently SEC approved NASDAQ board diversity rules, requiring listed companies have 2 or more self-identified diverse directors by 2023. But D&I falls under the larger social category in ESG, and corporations and their investors are increasingly expanding their consideration to include understanding of social risk created by their products and services and social risk in their supply chain. Examples might include accusations of disproportionately exposing minority neighborhoods to health-harming pollution, or products in their supply chain created in factories with links to forced labor in China, for example. Now, there are various ESG frameworks in the marketplace are being introduced that are leveraged by corporations and investors to measure and benchmark their impact. A common framework we see is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. So the UN established the 17 SDGs in 2015, which built upon the Millennial Development Goals. The Paris Agreement actually came about 3 months after these. The 2 SDG goals that tie directly back to D&I are the SDG 5, which is achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, and SDG 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. So as you can see, when we look at oil and gas risk incidents towards the top right corner there, we see it's relatively small compared to the other SDGs. So does this mean that D&I risk events are minor or are infrequent? Not necessarily. So RepRisk derives its risk incidents and subsequent scores from publicly available sources. So for a D&I issue to appear in our database, it has to first be reported within the corporation and then appear in the public eye. Past research study indicates that only 30% of discrimination or harassment issues are reported, and less than 15% of those actually file legal charges. So to summarize my point, risk associated with diversity and inclusion is difficult to analyze, but we shouldn't equate that to its absence. So when we think about this industry, oftentimes we think about environmental issues. But let's take a look at some comparative statistics from a social perspective. So looking at the sector overall, we see a fewer percentage of oil and gas companies have been linked to social issues, but we see a higher percentage of Canadian issues linked to social issues compared to others across the world. And looking at all 3 segments, E, S, and G, we see social issues consistently over the past 2, 4, and 8 years make up about 42 to 44% of the ES and G pie. So drilling into that social category, the top 3 issues in our database include impact on communities, occupational health and safety, and local participation issues. So looking at specifically impact on communities, further drilling into that, we can see that impact on Indigenous people as our primary social risk, driving social risk in Canadian oil and gas companies. If we think about risk by quantifying the number of risk incidents in the RepRisk database. So examples of risk incidents in our system impacting Indigenous people can range from a project located on Indigenous land that's criticized for allegedly using fracking techniques that result in methane emissions that ultimately contribute to climate degradation. It could be a pipeline near a river impacting water supply or wage disparities. But when we look at the risk in a different way, more specifically severity, for instance, it does paint a different picture. So we can see here that discrimination in employment is our third highest ESG risk category for Canadian oil and gas companies. So this confirms that that discrimination issues, while they may be underreported in the workplace, they do have a damaging impact from a reputational perspective. So what we're seeing with a 39 score of discrimination in employment is essentially saying that, you know, the magnitude of the issue was severe, and the source that RepRisk gathered that information from was likely a well-read and highly circulated source. So I just do want to point out that when we're looking at these scores, it's a score from 0 to 100, 100 being the worst. 50 and above is sort of a what you consider high risk type scenario. So a 14 is actually considered a low risk scenario, and that's and in fact, when we look at Canada as a whole, it's from a reputational risk perspective, it's on the lower end of countries globally. So that wraps up my portion of it. I want to thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Joe. Our next presenter today is Brendan Sulz. He is the president of the Society for the Preservation of Oilfield Good Guys, or SPOGG. SPOGG's core values are to provide honest, open mentorship and education about the upstream oil and gas industry in Canada. And under Brendan's leadership, they recognize the value in stronger industry integration with the next generation of professionals. I can attest to this because I know that SPOGG has been a great supporter of state students. Brendan is an active community volunteer and has 10 plus years of oil and gas experience and demonstrated success in building effective business relationships. Please welcome Brendan Sulz.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, my name is Brendan Sulz, and I'm here to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, in the oil and gas industry. Before I start my presentation, let me first state that there are many dimensions to diversity. And in the case of the oil and gas industry, there is a lot of overlay between issues like climate change and diversity. So for the sake of time, I'll simply highlight one or two key takeaways rather than try and boil the ocean. As a starting point, I think it is relevant to pull back a bit to the 50,000 foot level to remind ourselves of a couple of key premises. In the context of a rapidly changing world, let's start with things that remain unchanged in the oil and gas sector. First, the industry wants to be competitive here at home, across North America, and globally. Second, the industry will always need access to capital to grow production, expand markets, and to deliver value to consumers and investors. I'm going to link the diversity issue to both the competitiveness and access to capital point. So, building on the need for oil and gas companies to be both competitive and have access to capital, we need to really understand the fundamental sea change that has occurred in respect of both. Investor and asset owners around the world, whether banks or pension funds like CPPIB or AIMCO, or asset managers like BlackRock, are all putting a major focus on the energy transition and to safeguarding the value of their investments throughout the energy transition. The bad news is that there is tremendous pressure for institutional investors to divest from traditional fossil fuels. Some already have. The good news is that there are still a lot of investors who see attractive investment opportunities across the entire energy spectrum. And they are working with oil and gas companies to better anticipate the transition pathways of their investments. The other good news is that there's tremendous opportunity for those in the Canadian oil and gas sector, particularly those that are leaders in ESG, to demonstrate their leadership on the global stage. But in In addition to the energy transition, there's also been a fundamental change in how investors and asset managers analyze a company that goes into their portfolio. Now, non-financial or pre-financial information must be integrated into the process to see how those non-financial factors are going to impact the value of the company in the future. Current investor focus is on the E in the ESG, environmental or the energy transition, but investors are also placing a very heavy focus on the S, the social factors and ESG factors. And major investors and asset owners around the world are putting a major focus on this. This is not a trend. This includes things like equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI factors. How a company does in terms of managing its workforce. How diverse is its workforce and promotion pipeline? How inclusive is its workforce? How inclusive is it of its stakeholders and communities? What is it doing as part of Aboriginal reconciliation? NGOs, special interest groups, and activists have successfully figured out that if they put pressure on capital and the allocation of it, then they will successfully get results. Pension funds and asset owners are seeing tremendous pressure from stakeholders and governments to make commitments, such as commitments to net zero in the portfolio, commitments to diversity and inclusion, and commitments to look through our underlying companies and see how they are performing on these metrics. Pension funds and asset owners are in turn putting pressure on asset managers like BlackRock and the companies themselves. The market has spoken, and the market has said that if your company is not operating in best practices in these areas, climate change, equity, diversity, and inclusion, Aboriginal reconciliation, then your cost of capital will be substantially higher because the asset owners are putting pressure on the asset managers who are then taking that into account when they price the companies. It could be argued that TC Energy had a number of blind spots that led to the destruction of billions of dollars of value with the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. But under the new CEO, they have taken those hard lessons to heart and have really pivoted their business strategy and their approach to EDI to position themselves as a leader in the industry. Regulators, stakeholders, communities, and investors have all taken notice. Energy transition. TC is seizing climate change and the energy transition as a massive business opportunity rather than a threat. Ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, leaning into electrification, as well as other transition capital projects, has diversified their business. On Aboriginal reconciliation, TC Energy recognizes Indigenous groups as right holders who have a distinct relationship to the land. And they understand that their business activities have the potential to affect these groups in a tangible way. In 2021, TC Energy was the first North American energy infrastructure company to publish an inaugural reconciliation action plan, which will support reconciliation commitments across North America. For stakeholders and communities, after Keystone XL, they are placing an emphasis on building long-lasting relationships with governments, communities, landowners, Indigenous groups, suppliers, vendors, contractors, as well as the public, and are seeking their input early and often throughout project timelines. Gender equity. In 2019, Bloomberg announced that TC Energy was one of 230 companies selected for the 2019 Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, which distinguishes companies committed to transparency in gender reporting and advancing women's equality. Added up, these things build TC's reputation on key financial and non-financial indicators, making the company more competitive and ensuring that they are in front of the line for access to capital. Therefore, there is fundamental change taking place in the way investors operate, particularly in relation to the oil and gas sector. It is not good enough to just understand financial metrics and quality of earnings. You need to understand pre-financial factors, and that is, what is that company you are investing in doing to get to net zero, to ensure its supply chain is resilient? What is it doing to ensure it has long-term talent strategy that will be diverse and inclusive in terms of how it recruits, manages, and retains talent? And what is it doing in terms of Aboriginal reconciliation efforts? Bottom line, finding capital is very difficult, and traditional information is priced into the market very, very quickly. So there is a real opportunity for investors that do their homework to identify factors and companies that are outperforming in these value metrics and which will provide more valuable investments in the long term. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brendan. That was, I'm sure everyone else found it as interesting as I did. And I'm looking forward to getting to our Q&A session after our last speaker. So last, but certainly not least, let me introduce Kevin Krausert. Sorry, I just feel like I just mispronounced your name there. Sorry, Kevin. Kevin is the CEO and co-founder of Avatar Innovations. And Avatar are an organization who seek to drive the energy transition through empowerment. Avatar Innovations is a groundbreaking energy transition corporate innovative partner, which unlocks emerging technologies inside oil and gas for commercialization and investment and scale. Kevin is a former president of Beaver Drilling and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience and is fueling the energy transition nationwide. Please welcome Kevin Krausert.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the kind introduction, and also thank you, SPE Calgary chapter, for putting this important panel together. Diversity and inclusion is an important topic, and probably more important as we think about effective tools for the long-term sustainability of our industry, as well as finding new ways of doing business. So I'll start with a little bit of an introduction of maybe how I think about equity and diversity and inclusion in somewhat of a unique way. My actual background before working in the oil and gas industry was in research neurosciences, and I worked at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And my grandfather, who worked on some of the first steam rigs in Turner Valley, it was very important to him that I went and worked on the rigs. So before what I thought was going to be jumping into my master's, I left the M&I and went out to work on the rigs as a roughneck in northern Alberta, and certainly a little bit of a fish out of water. And it really forced me, I think, to realize, first and foremost, I think all the phenomenal aspects of our industry. The incredible teamwork, the proficiency, the heavy engineering, bringing an important commodity to the world. But it also became apparent to me that there was, a certain consistency to the metrics. Drilling rigs are not the most diverse workplace around. I think it's improved a lot. And so really, I think, planted a seed for me of, how do you think about diversity in a capital intensive, safety critical, highly regulated business. So I worked my way up. I actually became CEO of that company and ran it for 8 years. And in the 2015, 2016 market crash, it became apparent to me that the drilling industry had changed structurally as opposed to cyclically. We were never going back to an 800 rig market, while at the same time we were rolling out very advanced drilling automation technologies. And I saw two things happening. First of all, a workforce being displaced by an energy transition and a oil price war half the way around the planet, with the skill sets perhaps unequipped to be able to navigate it, or poorly equipped. And then also the skill sets around new technology implementation, creativity, adaptability, resilience, hadn't been fostered in such a compliance-based, safe operating procedure approach to operating business. So that was really where the idea for Avatar came from, is how does innovation work? How can we bring new tech to market, in an industry facing rapid changes, but also delivering a product the world is in desperate need of? And innovation really works through, a creativity process of looking at things through different perspectives. So we created Avatar to build those perspectives and competencies, but we really realized that diversity is an absolutely critical cornerstone to driving new innovation in the industry. One way I think about this is the difference between sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. The sustaining innovation is the 3% better way of doing something. And we are phenomenal at doing that in our industry. Disruptive innovation is, the Netflix to Blockbuster, or the Uber to the taxi industry. And if you don't have a lot of diverse perspectives, you can generally tend to focus on the 3% innovation improvements, which are absolutely critical, but you can sometimes miss the forest for the trees through those things. And so diversity is not just about inclusion and creating a space of belonging. It's about opening your perspective so that you can see things from other people's perspectives and have a childlike creativity and curiosity to looking at emerging technologies. And I think that's really the leadership skill that we need as an industry, is how to manage complexity. One way I think about the difference between what's complicated and what's complex is building a pipeline through harsh terrain and under rivers and complicated rock. That's complicated. That's really, really complicated. And we put in effective systems for managing all those different steps in the change. Building a pipeline through 14 unceded Indigenous territories in the middle of a pandemic, that's complex. That requires different skill set to be able to look at it, to be able to manage that towards success. And so this is really, I think, where diversity comes in, is the ability to have the openness to see things from other people's perspective, to recognize that not everybody's looking at the problem in the same way that you are, and to be open and humble to that by creating a space of inclusion. So now, I guess maybe kind of in closing, from going from a work environment where I started in the oil and gas industry that was anything but diverse. Now, we just closed applications for Avatar 2022. We were delighted to get almost 800 applications for 250 spots. And without really applying an EDI filter, we had 42% racialized minorities and 39% women. So we've come a long way as an industry, and I think that speaks to the important work all of us have been doing. And I think it's the threads for us to really start going on an exciting future for the energy industry. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to the panel.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. We've heard from our 4 panelists today, and I was interested today in the number of common themes that existed across all 4 panelists. And there was, of course, a recognition that we are in an energy transition, and there are structural changes happening in our industry. And that was sort of this common recognition, but there was also common recognition that during that transition, there are so many benefits to EDI and ESG. There was the benefits of diversity that Kerri mentioned in terms of employee retention and stability, or that Brendan mentioned in terms of capital, securing capital. Sorry, I'm looking for, Joe was talking about Canada's ESG performance. And it's funny, when Joe and Brendan were talking, I was reminded of a SWOT analysis that I did in one of my classes this week. And we actually talked about Canada's ESG performance as an opportunity for our industry. So I was really excited when our panelists talked about that. Yeah, and so I guess we have some questions here in the Q&A, and we are ready to move on to talk about, to ask questions of the panel. So let me share the first question with you guys. This is a question for the panel. How does the panel see flexible remote workspaces supporting EDI efforts? For example, it's an important tool for retaining women and diverse staff in roles. There's a, I don't know, Kerri, if you want to talk to that, or if like there's a little follow-up question to that as well that says, how far should these policies extend? And does it extend to hiring people globally, or will they still need to be housed locally?
Sure, let me take a crack at that. So I definitely see workplace flexibility as supporting equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think it makes it much easier for single parents, whether they be men or women, to be able to manage their work and home lives, just as an example. So I do think that it is very helpful to being able to attract diverse candidates. I think it would certainly help to attract more women, for example. So I do think that that's very true. I also would say that how far that policy should extend and whether or not you should be looking globally, I think it certainly opens us up to being able to look for talent globally. But I think the answer is probably rather unique to each individual organization. You know, how important is it to be able to collaborate in person? What sort of an organizational culture do you have, and is that a fit? So I would say it's probably quite unique to different organizations. That's how I would answer that question.
Kerri, the second question actually goes to you as well. And I know, I think there are quite a few women here today, and I think this is something that hits home with us. And that is sort of this balance of opportunities versus preferential treatment, like what's equitable. And let me just read the question here. How about merit? I'm a female engineer from a racial minority, but I don't want to have more opportunities than other groups because I want my work to be worth as much as anyone else's. So equal opportunities, not preferential treatment. And how do we focus on merit and qualifications regardless of gender or race? And I just, Kerri, I thought you probably had something to say about that.
I'm sure I do. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think the way that I would answer it is the steps that we're taking, for example, at Cenovus around increasing the number of women in leadership isn't about giving women preferential treatment. It's really about removing any of the barriers that might exist. And so I'll give a couple of examples, having done this work in a previous life as well. One thing that we know is that women are less likely to apply on a position unless they tick every box, whereas men are more likely to apply for a job if they only have, part of the qualifications. And so how you actually advance women in leadership or advance female representation is by helping to remove some of those barriers. Is it, are there different language choices that you need to make in postings? Are there different places that you need to be able to advertise your position? So it's absolutely not about hiring people that are less qualified just because they're part of a diverse group. It's about figuring out what their barriers are to employment and barriers to advancement and addressing the barriers. It's not at all about giving preferential treatment. It's about making sure that we level the playing field.
Kerri, it's so interesting. It's very near and dear to my heart because I was a female geologist in leadership for a multinational. So anyway, I do have another question for you, Kerri, before I ask some questions of the other panelists. I was interested in the self-identification survey. So I can see what your point that gender is something that is currently tracked, it's currently measurable, and how do we expand that so that we can have more targets? So I was just wondering if you could just mention that a little bit, sort of explain what that would look like.
Oh, for sure. So self-identification surveys are, so first of all, really important to know that they're voluntary. Nobody is forced to answer the questions. But we ask questions around whether or not people identify as part of certain designated groups. And the reason that we do that is we want to understand how close or far away are we from looking like the communities that we work and live in. And unless we ask some of those questions, we wouldn't know. And so that's part of the reason why you ask the questions, and you compare yourself to things like census data and so on to see how close or far away you are. And then it allows you to see where your gaps are so that you can focus your efforts there to help make sure that you've got a representative workforce.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kerri. Next question that might be more for Brendan and Joe and Kevin. Sorry. I was just wondering about how we could leverage ESG for opportunities in the Canadian industry. And I thought that was something that, I don't know if Brendan or Joe wanted to talk about that. Joe, you talked specifically about Canada's ESG performance.
Yeah, could you just repeat one part of it? Jennifer, you had frozen up on me for a moment.
Oh, sorry. The question is, how do we think Canada can leverage their ESG, their low risk ESG for opportunities for the Canadian industry?
Well, yeah, I think it's just a matter of marketing yourself like that. I think sorry, you froze up on me again, Jennifer. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I don't have a lot to comment on that, other than, you know, it's comparatively speaking, when you think about how investors are using a system like RepRisk, they're looking at scores when they're potentially investing in companies, and typically clients that in the corporate world that are using our data are using it from either a supply chain perspective or an investor relation perspective. And so I think just being armed with all those facts when you're speaking to potential investors, how the world is seeing ultimately is good from a financial perspective.
Awesome, Joe. I'm wondering if Brendan wants to weigh in on that. I know, Brendan, you had mentioned it in terms of capital investment. Joe just talked about that a little bit. Any thoughts on how Canada's history of ESG performance can be leveraged?
I was combing through a bunch of material in preparation for this, and I came across some interesting things. And you're right, like, I think we should be leveraging our ESG performance, because it's definitely, what we're doing in Canada in oil and gas is very good, but we're still struggling right now. And so one of the things I went through was from John Graham, who's the president and CEO of CPPIB, and I really liked his comment. And this was at the Alberta Energy and Growth Forum. And he said that they're determined to have their stakeholders understand the important distinction between making a long-term bet on oil and gas versus supporting leading conventional energy producers in their strategic transformation. So what he was saying is that it's not about just choosing Canadian oil and gas right now. It's not like either you're choosing it or you're not choosing it. It's about being there and helping and guiding companies through this energy transition. So taking a look at these metrics and leveraging them and making sure that capital are available to the right companies as we go through this energy transition. And so that was one quote that I really liked, that I thought kind of lended itself to that question.
Awesome.
And I have just an additional comment. The next question actually put this thought in my head regarding recruiting as well to your industry. ESG is very much a younger generation in terms of popularity, it's very much a generational topic we see. And, marketing the oil and gas industry as ESG friendly and promoting the various things that you're all doing in that industry, I think would ultimately help from a recruiting perspective as well.
Absolutely. That's a good point. Joe, thanks. I'm just going to share that next question for the attendees here who aren't looking at the Q&A. So we are aware that in the recent downturn in the Canadian industry, we've seen a reduction of enrollment in the petroleum engineering students, for example. And this was evident when University of Calgary suspended its petroleum engineering program. And so the question is about how or where should the oil and gas sector focus their efforts on attracting younger talents and preventing a talent gap in the future. And I think this is a really relevant question because as we see our industry rebounding post-COVID, where are we getting our staff from, and are they really diverse? I don't know, Kerri, would that be a good one to pitch to you?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about anything. So, I think part of the way that we start to attract more candidates into our industry is, as others have said, it's really about marketing. I think there's a certain perception of our industry that exists that I think, isn't necessarily fair or accurate. So I do think that there's an opportunity for us to talk about all of the good work that we're doing from an ESG perspective. So I think that's part of it. I think it's also really having a good conversation in schools and like starting early, have conversations about what kinds of careers exist in our industry and helping people to sort of understand that there are really good opportunities in this industry and it's not the big bad industry that people seem to think it is. I think there's a lot of myth busting that we can do and a lot of sort of early, I think we can reach out early to folks in schools to be having the right conversations so that they're keeping us in mind as they're making their career choices.
That's certainly something we've been talking about at SAIT, reaching further down. Are we and I know I used to do this as well when I was with the CSPG. We would, in an outreach capacity, how do you reach people that are younger and attract them to the industry in a way? A lot of what we learn in the industry isn't really covered in high school. And so if you don't have a direct attachment to the industry, how do you decide to pursue something like that, particularly when you see what's in the media? So I think we've all kind of touched on that. I don't have any unanswered questions right now in the Q&A, and I'm looking at my list, and I'm wondering if I would throw it back to the speakers for a minute and say, is there something you missed, or is there something this conversation has triggered for you? All right, well, I'm thinking that means we are going to be, unless there are any more questions from the crowd. I think that might be it for us today in our first of 4 ESG talks from the SPE. The next in this 4 ESG series, this first on EDI, the second is actually on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's on February 16th. And I'm sure when you registered for this event, you maybe saw that there was a whole series, and maybe some of you have already registered for the whole series. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Dale Hansen, the Associate Dean of the McPhail School of Energy, Kerri Rudnicki from Cenovus, Brendan Sulz from SPOGG, Kevin Krausert from Avatar Innovations, and Joe Schuhow from RepRisk USA. I think they all had really interesting things to say about EDI and how it impacts our industry and the potential benefits to it. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us. I see there's some questions coming in. And the coordinators for these events, this 4-part series, Ryan Capri, and other contributors, including Sharif Abdul Rahman, Nick Robbins, our host today, Bida Malikian, and Darren Smith, the team lead for this series. And so thank you very much. And I appreciate everyone's attendance today.